pleased to introduce to you John Willinsky. He's he's the Koslow Family Professor of Education at Stanford University and author of a number of books. Two have won outstanding awards. The Access Principle, The Case for Open Access to Research and Scholarship is one of them. He's directing the Public Knowledge Project in cooperation with Canadian University. He'll tell you a little bit about that. You'll hear about that some in the next presentation. But today he's going to reflect with us on intellectual property, in a way copyright, and its impact on learning. John.
Thank you, Martha. Well, welcome everybody. I've been away, so it's great to be back in sunny California again, where it's quite beautiful. I'm your warm-up act, I think, in a way, in terms of the technical presentations that come. I'm like the vegetables you have to finish before the dessert, because I'm going to talk about history. I'm going to talk about the backstory. I'm going to try to put in a larger context the work that we're doing around the future of content. And I want to do that in a way that has some currency, even though I'm going to go back to the Middle Ages, even though I'm going to step back into the early modern era. I do still want to have some relevance. So let me situate this a bit in terms of the future of content. I am going to talk about it, and Martha did frame this in terms of the scope of Media X. Its range is amazing to me. It does deal with the K-12 schools, where I had my beginning as a school teacher. It deals with the larger world of content and digital access rights and all of the different areas. It's focused largely on new media. That's the Media X part, I guess. And it's focused on technical approaches, solutions, if you like. And I think all of that has to be thought of in terms of a larger historical context. And I'm going to focus on intellectual property because, heaven forbid, we're in the capital of intellectual property in terms of this country and world. And we're in an interesting spot because we're on a university grounds and a wonderful campus that is itself at an interesting relationship. It is tax exempt from the rest of the world. It has a special standing, and I want to play on that a bit. And in particular, I want to play on the notion that we produce a kind of content at this institution that we need to take into account, that we have a partnership that Media X exemplifies, a partnership around the meeting of, if you like, commerce and the academy. And I want to talk a bit about that relationship. There is a dependency, I would say that's fair enough, but there is a distance. We don't have formal gates when you come into this university, but if you notice in the small print on the signs as you come in, it's very clear that this is a separate entity, that this is the private grounds of a not-for-profit institution that exists under a special legal... You haven't read the fine print, I guess, as you come in. But if you walk in, you have time to read this about the tax-exempt clause, and donations are welcome, and that they will be tax-exempt. So this whole status question for me is an interesting one. But it's also a current and pressing one. It's also something that is being fought in the courts and in Congress. And I want to bring it into that point around this concept of intellectual property. Now, Martha mentioned my title, The Intellectual Properties. Actually, she didn't mention the Canadian University. Let me give credit to Simon Fraser University in Canada. We have more than one. I'm a Canadian, and I have two compatriots from Canada here, Alex and Juan, as part of the Public Knowledge Project. So just a little international recognition. But this idea then that the intellectual properties of learning is a distinction I want you to hold in your head. The idea that intellectual property doesn't yet it has the beginnings of a formal division, but the lessons I'm learning from this history that I'm doing is all about the distinctions are more deeply set, that the distinctions are part of a long tradition in which intellectual property from within the field of learning is distinct from the intellectual property that operates outside of that field. And the tax exemption is a trace of that, a historical trace of that. And there are others as well. In fair use, in copyright, there's an exemption for research. In patent law, there is an exemption for research in terms of infringement of patents. So all through the law and all through our history, there is a kind of recognition, an understanding that there is something different about the intellectual properties of work. And I use the word properties intentionally because property has this kind of plurality. You can talk about all of the intellectual property on this campus. But the properties are an important part to me because one of the things that does distinguish learning is its interest in properties or qualities. That one of the things that distinguishes us from Apple and its intellectual property assets is we're interested in all of the qualities of the intellectual property we hold in our hands. That every time we take a book out of the library, we are curious about its intellectual properties, even though that library represents a commons. That library represents a space where intellectual property rules do not hold. We're able to take out as many books as we want. In fact, one of the lovely privileges at this institution is undergraduate students somehow have the right to requisition books that I'm working on at that moment. And I am told about the fines that will accrue if I do not rush to the library with that book. And that kind of equality or democracy of access to knowledge is what I'm here to talk about. This idea that within the academy there are a different set of rights associated with this intangible property. And intellectual property is generally defined as a series or a set of rights that are associated with an intangible good. And the idea that those rights might be different when you come into this university campus, when you as the public, those of you among the public out here, the secular, the lay people, you have 7 access privileges a year into the Stanford University library. Yes, 7, I'm not sure why that magic number is the number, but at any rate, 7 times a year you can come in and have full access to the entire goods within that commons, within that space where everything is held in common. So where did these ideas come from? Let me give you one more kind of current aspect and why this is a dilemma. I am part of a movement, if you like, an advocacy group called Open Access. Juan and Alex are part of that as well, and maybe others in this room too. What we're interested in is a very simple proposition, born of the internet, even though I'm going to talk about it in a much earlier period. Born of the, if I get to that part of you're saying to yourself, if he gets to that part of his talk, fair enough. This open access movement is interested in one element, and that is to take the notion of the library as a commons where all knowledge is available to everyone equally, whether they are an impatient undergraduate student interested in the books that I'm working on or anything else. And so this idea that there is a distinction is critical, but the open access movement says that in fact all of this information should be available to everyone, not just at the Stanford University library, which happens to be one of the best in the world, but down the road or up the road or anywhere else in this state or anywhere else in this world. Every student and faculty member should have the same access. Why wouldn't that be right? Well, it's because there's an intellectual property regime which says that unless you purchase the rights to that work, you cannot share it freely. And the open access movement says, but there's something about scholarship and research that should be freely available to everyone, to every member of the public, not just taxpayers, although that's part of the argument, because this tax-exempt institution is in a sense relying on the goodwill of taxpayers in order to exempt all of the resources here from any kind of taxation system that has been democratically established in this country. So this idea that the open access movement is struggling and looking and inventing ways of trying to increase access to knowledge is an underlying principle. And I've been involved in it for about 15, I'm embarrassed to say 15 years, because why hasn't it been a success yet? Why are there still some things that aren't open access? About 20% of the entire literature produced this year in all of the journals will be available to members of the public, to doctors and physicians, to teachers, lawyers, policymakers, legislators. So this to me has become a particularly pointed issue. We've had some great success. 20% is way better than it was 5 years ago in terms of the literature. And compared to 20 years ago, it is, I should be happy. I should just back off and say enough is enough. What more do I want? What's with this 100% or the 80%, that magic 80% figure? So it came to a head on January 17th of this year. There was a lovely legislative coup in Congress. On January 17th, there was an appropriations bill passed by both houses, the House and the Senate. And in the passing of that bill, I pulled it up online to find the little clause that I want to share with you. The bill is over 1,000 pages long, and what was so brilliant is they squeezed in a very controversial measure into those 1,000 pages. Now, I'm sure normally every congressman and senator would be, every congressman would be reading through those 1,000 pages and normally would have caught this and highlighted it and said, no, this is not going forward. But apparently, this was on page 622, and a lot of them stopped probably around page 500. I mean, a typical congressman. So what went through on January 17th of this year is a measure that requires open access for all of the agencies, federal agencies, that grant more than $100 million in research money to universities and other researchers, private industry as well. And all of that taxpayer money, about $30 billion worth of taxpayer money, anyone who takes it and publishes an article must share that, must make it public. All over the country when this passed, very quietly. It wasn't called the Open Access Bill. It wasn't called we're going to bust the publishers bill. It was called Appropriations Bill. And I said, yes, that is so appropriate to get us open access. And it got through. And it has been, believe me, for 5 years we have been fighting in different measures. A separate bill dedicated to this has been killed about 3 times at least. But to slip it into the appropriation bill on page 672 was just like brilliant. Why didn't we think of that before, 5 years ago? But wait, the publishers, and the publishers aren't the enemy here. What's the enemy here is a failure to make a distinction between learning and Lady Gaga. Or sorry, more appropriately, given my background, Justin Bieber, academic research. The failure to make that distinction is hurting high school students, physicians, university students around the world. Because Lady Gaga and Justin Bieber are 99 cents a download. And academic research is between $23 and $45 a download. And nobody ever plays the academic research more than once. And Justin, heck, I've got it going all the time. So this is the issue, and what happened in this appropriations bill is the clause says any recipient of federal funding from education, labor, health, social services, any of the different agencies in the federal, anyone who receives funding and publishes an article must make that article freely available to everyone not less than 12 months after it's published. It can be locked up for 12 months, but wait. And when it is released, it has to at least be the author's final draft, with all of the spelling mistakes retained and all of the small but nice copy editing changes that make a big difference in our work left out. And all of the beautiful layout, no margins, very small font, all of those wonderful things that publishers do to research, not included. And this is the issue. This is the battle we're fighting right now. That what happened in that wonderful move, which many of us went, yes, over, is that we got second-class access to the final, peer-reviewed, final draft 12 months after. Now, does this 12 months make any difference? Let me give a shout out to Laura Moorhead sitting at the back there, who's working on a study in which we gave physicians, I will get to this history, I promise you. Laura's working on a study of 400 physicians. We used a wonderful system of recruiting physicians by tweeting our campaign. We said, hey, we'll give you free access to the entire library at Stanford University online. You can't come on campus. Free access to the entire library at Stanford University for 1 year if you sign up in our study, because we want to know, would free access make a difference to a public health official or to a physician? Would they use it if we gave it? Would they come if we built it? Because doctors are very busy. I don't know if you've noticed. Have you ever had, yes, you got through half of the New Yorker one time when you were waiting? Yeah. So this idea then that we would give access was it was really a test. Would it matter? And what happened was, through this wonderful Laura's tweeting campaign, we were hitting, our target was 50, our minimum was 50, we were hoping to get 100, we had 400. in total. Go like this when I leave the podium, as it were, in terms of truth. So we have 400 physicians who signed up for this free access for 1 year. And I just have to share with you a couple of anecdotes, because we're only halfway through the study, and everything I say, well, let's turn the tape off for a moment, because we haven't published this. It hasn't been peer reviewed. But I can say that we did get an email, now, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, an email from an addiction center. Physicians from an addiction center, and they said to us, we work in an addiction center, we understand addiction, and we're addicted to this research. Where's your methadone treatment plan to get us off this addiction to this research? We're using it every week. We've never had this kind of access before. But we're also looking at that 12-month embargo period when after an article is published. And we're saying to ourselves, what difference would that make for physicians? And we're about 35%, 30 to 40% of the research. It's good when you have a fact checker just sitting in the audience like that. 35 to 40% of the research is within 1 year that the physicians are finding useful. And the way that we understand open access now, the way that we are equating Lady Gaga protecting her financial interests, and the way that we're protecting the financial interests behind this intellectual property asset is a problem. And the problem, again, is that we're failing to make a basic distinction in terms of intellectual property. Now, I have been making this argument for a long time, unsuccessfully. And the idea that it would make any difference if I give you a bit of the historical background is probably a dream on my part, probably a bit of a naivete. But on the other hand, as an academic, as a card-carrying PhD, I have an obligation. I have a responsibility not just to pound the table, but to talk about where this idea came from. As it were, to have some sense of responsibility for why I think this is right. And why I'm not the first person, or why the group of us who are involved in this, and I'm not the only one by any means, but why the Public Knowledge Project groups and all the other groups, Spark initiatives, the Public Library of Science, a whole series of groups that are very strong advocates of this idea, why we're not just making this up. And it again hinges around a notion of intellectual property, a notion of private property in this country in particular being sacred. That 12-month embargo, remember from the Appropriations Bill? That 12-month embargo to the final draft, it says messy in quotation marks, in brackets. The final messy draft of the author is a protection of the private property of those people who own the articles, which happen to be the publishers, because we sign it over to them. So where is this historical concept? Where would an idea come from that this isn't right? And I started in two places. I started with John Locke, who then becomes I'll tell you why in my conclusion. And I decided to do a prehistory of intellectual property. What is it about intellectual property that I would think learning is different from? The history of intellectual property, let me give you that part first. You didn't think you'd get so much for so little investment. The history of intellectual property begins in 1710, the proper history, because in 1710, the Statute of Anne in the British Parliament is passed. And the Statute of Anne is the first piece of legislation in any language, first piece of legislation that recognizes the author has a right in their work. A right for 14 years, but a right in their work, has a right in their work forever, but in light of that right, they are granted a monopoly for only 14 years. Now, today, 70 years after the death of the author, because the author needs to continue to put flowers on their grave. But then, as it started, Mickey Mouse needs to continue in perpetuity. Then, as it started, 14 years. And so in 1710, the history of intellectual property really begins. The term enters the language 4 or 5 decades later, but that is the beginning in 1710. And so I wanted to understand what came before that, because what happened in 1710 was the Statute of Anne was passed, and that statute was called an act to make the publishers rich beyond their wildest dreams. No, it wasn't. How could you not shaking your heads? It wasn't called that. An act to keep knowledge out of the hands of researchers. No, it wasn't called that. It was called an act for the encouragement of learning. And that was kind of a trigger point for me, that the entire invention of intellectual property in terms of text was for the encouragement of learning. Hello? No 12-month embargo written on that statement. How could that be? How could learning bring together the very divisive forces of the British Parliament at that time, how could it organize people to say that something is so important about learning, we're going to grant a monopoly? And this was not a good time for monopolies. They were throwing kings out at that time because of the way they were tossing out monopolies, marmalade monopolies, biscuit monopolies, publishing monopolies. And so this idea then that learning was the cause of intellectual property is the first very important idea that I decided to look into. That learning contributed, that we deserve more credit for what we have contributed to the very concept that there is an intellectual property. Where did that come from? And so that led me to looking at a history that runs from the earliest monasteries of the Christian West right down to John Locke, who died just a few years, 6 years, 1704, before this statute. And so I try to position and give him credit, but I'm really interested in John Locke because he had a theory of property. But let me just step briefly through this history with all due allowance for time. So the monasteries, let's just deal with that because this campus, the pleasure and privilege of being on this campus, it has a wonderful monastic quality to it. And I just want to give you just a couple of examples so that we're both on the same ground. The continuity for me is amazing. Now, the vow of celibacy, I was I was kind of taken aback when I first came and all those sorts of things. But all of that apart, what is really monastic about this property is the crypt, is the grave. Have any of you been out to see the crypt for Leland and Jane and Leland Jr.? At Halloween, they have a special little ceremony out there. So just over here, just over here in the trees in a lovely area when you come into the campus where it's kind of wild and eucalyptus smelling and dusty. All that area coming in there, they're buried on this ground. And that is so monastic because every monastery that was created with a founding gift of property. This university started with a founding gift of now 8,000 acres, probably about 5,000 when they gave it, the farm as we call it. Leland and Jane Stanford, in honor of their dearly departed son, gave this property. And the reason that the nobles, beginning in the 5th or 6th century in Europe, began to give this property was to get them halfway to heaven. Let's be crass about it. You gave property, you took that property out of the economy, out of the feudal economy, and you set it off as a reserve to get you to heaven, to say that this property will be just a place of prayer, a place of devotion, a place where people learned and studied and prayed over Scripture. And in that process, they would achieve a kind of holiness, a kind of importance that could not be achieved in the usual world of feuding and sword fighting and clashing and drinking. And, well, I won't get into the details. It's really, you've probably seen the movie, actually. So this idea, then, that there is a place that is removed from the world, and in that place, which was not tax exempt, but was removed in terms of the monasteries, and where there would be a great attention to devotion. In fact, the monasteries were not places of learning. They were places of prayer in the first instance. Learning had to earn its way into the monasteries. Because prayer and the kind of humility, like you couldn't be an author. You couldn't say, hey, I just wrote the best commentary on the Song of Solomon. You should see my commentary on the Song of Solomon. No, see, that would be like wrong. It's humility. And we still, here at Stanford, we still take that vow. You're laughing. Maybe not all of us take the vow of humility. Not every day. So this idea then that the monastery would become a place of learning had to be earned. And the funny thing that worked again, St. Benedict invents a rule that really makes all of the Benedictine monasteries very holy places. But in that rule, Benedict has almost no place for learning, except apart from learning the Scripture, that is, and all that's associated with that, all the liturgy. But what happened is he set aside 4 hours a day for reading of Scripture. And what I love about this is that setting aside 4 hours a day for the reading of Scripture is going to create learning no matter what you want. You can't spend 4 hours a day reading something without kind of having a few stray thoughts, without beginning to think, wait a second, this doesn't align with it. Wait, there is a contradiction. When Christ was in the desert and there is something, how come nobody's ever... Let me just make a note in the margin. I want someone else to see these contradictions. I want someone else to see how it is that the Old Testament and the New Testament really do correspond to each other. I want people to, and in that process, a kind of interest in learning arose. And I don't want to go into the details, except to notice this kind of transubstantiation, this way in which someone gave a piece of property, and it was transformed into, through the sheep skins made into vellum and the inks ground from flowers, into the manuscripts, created intellectual property. And it was intellectual property because the monks and nuns, and it was very gender equitable, there were double monasteries run by abbesses. The monks and nuns, and the universities, by the way, then cut off all of the women, as many of you know, in terms of access. The monks and nuns were beginning to value the property of the text itself. We're beginning to say that Venerable Bede's commentary on Job was really interesting and should be compared to St. Jerome's. And this idea of valuing the particular qualities of a text and copying it very carefully and getting angry when other people made mistakes in the copying of it and putting notes in the margins saying this is a mistake, all of that is the beginning of the valuing of intellectual property. And all of it took place in a part that was slightly removed from the world, that was a gated community that had cloisters just like the quad here. You enter those gates into the quad. You walk in the inside. Now, we're very daring. We have outside. But in the medieval period, you did not have outside cloisters and arcades. That was just asking for a spear through the heart. You had interior cloisters that you walked in and you meditated on the text that you'd been reading for 4 hours. Only 2.5 in the winter because of the short light period. So this idea that we create intellectual property in the first instance within a place that has, by the way, no private property. The first rule in St. Benedict's rule, not the first rule, the 23rd rule, let's imagine. Anyone checking me on this? Good. Anyone checking on Facebook? Anyone checking in? Good. Okay, don't check. The 23rd rule in St. Jerome's is that you shall have neither a pen nor a book, nor any other form of private property in the monastery. And this idea that everything would be shared, every text would be shared. They chained the books to the library shelves, not because they were going to be stolen, but because everyone should have equal access and no one should keep it in their monastic cell. And those principles are at the beginning of a valuing of intellectual property. Now, let me jump ahead just a little bit here. I hope I'm not going too fast. That's about 700 years at that point. What we also have then is the beginning of the universities, women excluded, and terrible setback in terms of equal access. But the universities see themselves as separate. They're not devoted to prayer. They are devoted to learning. But the universities have a similar set of properties. And at the center of them is the university library. And at the center of that university library is a notion that everyone has equal and complete access to that. And a similar kind of relationship in terms of the economy. Remember the donation of the land? I forgot to tell you one thing about the crypt. One of the things the nobles would do when they gave the land is they would say, we want to reserve a few rights. If you're going to be the holiest place on earth, if you're going to be that close to heaven, when I'm going to die, I wonder if you could give me a lift. I wonder if you could bring me into the gates on my deathbed. I'd like to, be celibate and I'd like to be a monk before that, but I'm very busy and vigorous. And so the monks would literally, you would hear them running, clop, 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 the Monty Python clopping. You'd hear them running because they would be bringing a dead noble, a near dead, they had to die on their way to heaven, into the gates. And then someone got really smart and said, listen, why don't you just bury me? I will give you 100 extra acres if you bury me on the property and build a crypt dedicated to me and say mass with my name in it into God's ear. Because you guys are so holy, you are looking into the face of God. And if you say, John Willinsky, really good work, well cited, if you repeat that often enough, there'll be no problem. And so they ended up burying the nobles on the grounds of the monastery. Have you made the connection? Can I go on now? Because it went on in the universities, not just here at Stanford. Stanford was not an imitation, but Stanford was part of a long tradition. And if you ever have a chance to go to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and I have a whole chapter on this in terms of the book that I'm working on, because the Bodleian is a fascinating example, in which I taught at the Bing program overseas for 1 quarter, part of Stanford's program overseas, and we visited all that. I did a course on the history of learned books. It wasn't for the students, it was for me, because I was still new to this. And we saw hundreds of the most gorgeous ancient manuscripts and printed books, and not one of them had been bought by the university. Every one had been donated. Everyone had been contributed from that crass and sordid London business district into this sacred territory, much as every rare book in this library has been donated. And so some of you may be thinking to yourself, are we just a money laundering institute on the way to heaven? And I would say, no, that's very crass and that's cynical. But there is something about this economy that says we can circulate, as it were, whether it's feudalism or capitalism or whateverism, we can circulate our resources in a way that advances learning, as long as we keep learning at a distance. And this is what happened to John Locke. John Locke had a double life in the 17th century. He was patronized. He had a lovely studentship, one of the best studentships at Christ Church. He had it till it was so good. He kept it till he was 53. I know, perpetual adolescence, you're wondering. He had to be thrown out by the king because he crossed the line. Because he also had a patron, Lord Shaftesbury, who was an insurrectionist who wanted to see Charles II thrown off the throne, as it were, around religious issues, Protestantism. Charles II wanted his brother to take the throne, James II, who was a Catholic. Messy, I don't want to get into the details. But what I do want to say is that Locke was caught between this. Locke had a patron who had thousands of acres of land, who was, as it were, part of the agricultural capitalism of 17th century England, and he had a university sinecure. And as part of his job for the Lord Shaftesbury, as part of his work as a political insurrectionist, he invents the relationship between private property and democracy. And this is where it gets tricky. John Locke establishes the principles in the two treatises. Heaven forbid I forget that. The two treatises of government. In the two treatises of government, he has a chapter of property in which he lays out the principles by which property, private property, is not the divine right of kings, but is the law of nature. And it's a natural law, which is to say God's law. This is a period where reason and revelation are kind of working their way out here. It is a natural law because each of us has possession of ourselves. You ready to accept that? Anyone have any self-possession here? I hope so. Each of us has possession of ourselves, and if we mix our labor with something, we have a natural right to it. He uses America as his example. He talks about Indians, Native Americans, and he talks about the bow and arrow and the shooting of the deer and how that labor creates a natural right. Because in the beginning, he says, the world was given to us by God in common. The world begins as a common, and we need to justify private property. Not as the divine right of kings. That day is done. We need to justify private property in relationship to a natural law. And he sees that in the exertion of labor. What he doesn't do is he doesn't distinguish between intellectual property, fair enough, but he doesn't distinguish between the different forms of labor and the different kinds of relationships, which I'm trying to establish between the university, where he lived very comfortably till he was 53, on and off. He would go visit London. Lord Shaftesbury's lovely palatial home in London is one of his other patrons. But this idea that within property, within our rights to property, there might be a reason to keep property common is what I think the university exemplifies, what I think the university library exemplifies. The commons of the library is why we are, in fact, productive. Our ability to tap into other people's knowledge is why we can create knowledge. And we do it in a way that's different than Justin and Lady. We do it in a way that is based on very close building and citation and reference and analysis. And those intellectual properties of very close and tight argument against references and commentary and critique and ignoring other people's work, as often happens to me. That whole system and structure is a different way of earning a right to everybody's property. And I take responsibility for everyone else's intellectual property. I do personally, every time I devastatingly critique an article. It's a duty and a pleasure to hurt other people's feelings in the course of my research because I have a responsibility for everyone else's property, and then I have earned a right to everybody else's property, and that is not true for Justin Bieber. I have not yet had a chance to peer review my compatriot's music. Well, I've had the right, but I don't think he's been listening. And so this idea that there is a different order, a different regulation, a different set of rights involved in intellectual property on the university campus is something that we're in the midst of fighting. That Congress has been charged with a responsibility for deciding how should this knowledge circulate. That Stanford University has open access journals among its undergraduate students, that Highwire Press at Stanford University has a large database full of articles that are freely available, that in many, many different fields and in many, many different disciplines, we are in the midst of journals that are charging as high as $20,000 to $30,000 a year for a subscription. And in the same field, take biology, the highest ranked journal in biology is called Public Library of Science, PLOS Biology. The highest ranked journal is free, has always been free, has never charged a reader, charges its authors. And so we're in the midst of deciding the future of content in terms of access. And the most significant change in content is not going to be Justin Bieber for 59 cents. The biggest change in content in the coming years is we're going to see some 2 million research articles a year, 2 million research articles in every discipline that pertains to your family physician, to your own personal interest, to the work that your students and children are interested in. 2 million articles a year are going to become freely available to everyone, and they were not ever before. And so the future of content at its most exciting, at its most game-changing level is going to be about the intellectual properties of learning. Now, how that is going to happen, what mechanism and device and economic strategy is going to be explained to you by the following speakers who are coming after me. And so I'm just the warm-up act, as it were, the introductory tale, in terms of why the Media X sponsorship and why the presentations you are about to see are going to help change that future of content. But as that takes place, I want you to think about this idea of intellectual property and the possibility that the divisions right now that are kind of confused, 12-month delay, final draft, the kind of recognition that this knowledge should be freely available, but we're not quite sure how yet to do it, and besides, people aren't really, they are interested. The doctors we're working with are very interested. They want a methadone plan for us to get them off this. The public is interested. They go into PubMed, the largest life sciences database in the world, sponsored by the American government, every day. So don't tell me the public aren't interested. They're confused about how to do this. They're not certain yet, but you are. You now have an understanding. And so I'm deputizing you to go out there, because we're going to have these kinds of decisions to make over the next few years about how should this property be decided. And I want you to think about this division between the intellectual properties of learning and the music of Justin Bieber and Lady Gaga. Thank you very much.